The Religion Business docuseries is finally here, and today I'm going to let you know the verdict on episode 1 and what you can expect from the start of the show. Now, if you haven't watched it, you're probably going to want to after this, but if you've watched it already, let me know your thoughts and let me know if you think I missed anything in the comments below. But guys, we've waited long enough for this docuseries to finally release. It's gotten pushed back multiple times, but it's finally here. We can talk about it. So let's jump straight in today for a review and a recap of episode 1 of the Religion Business docuseries. Now, right off the bat in episode 1, we run into something that is gonna make some Christians and some viewers uncomfortable. And if it makes you uncomfortable, I totally get that. I just want to encourage you. You don't have to change your convictions. You don't have to change your theology of any kind, but don't let something bother you to the point of turning it off if it's just something that's little or just something that happens at the beginning. But I want to give people a warning. Like when we're doing this review and recap, at the very beginning, it's got this great intro. I'm not going to show you the intro because I want you to see it. But in the intro, it starts with 11 million years ago or 11 billion years ago or something like that. But it says in the beginning, some people think, and there are going to be some that I know that's going to be difficult because if you're a young earth person, then you're going to say, no, the universe didn't start with a big bang. It didn't start with all that. But this is just an intro. It's okay to disagree with that. But the intro of this thing is pretty awesome. It basically just walks through history, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and you just see history unfold throughout to, hey, what was the original church? And then it just zooms through history. How has the church changed since Jesus started and established the church? And guys, I know the very beginning might give people some pause. It's very visually appealing, and it really makes you think about the church in a very different way and how it's morphed into an enterprise and an institution of sorts, especially in the United States, in a really unique way. You see this at the beginning, but you also see this toward the end of the show. And I think it's, like I said, it looks awesome, but it's also very thought-provoking. And that's kind of how this thing starts. And it takes a little while to really get going. You have your big visual intro. You've got a couple other things that are going on. You got a mega church kind of reenactment, and Nathan kind of walking through that and sharing a little bit more of his why for this docu-series. So again, for the creatives, it's very visually appealing. I think you're really going to like it. If you're a person who goes, Jeff, I'm not as much of a creative, I want to jump right into the content. Hey, if that's you, you may think it starts out a little slow. Just move forward a little bit. Okay, really starts diving into the content. I think about 10 minutes. And but then the first interview that it shows, this is going to be one of the only ones where you don't see the interview thread throughout the entire thing. Because once you hear an interview with someone in episode 1, you can bet you're going to continue to hear a conversation with them throughout, except for the first interview. And the first interview actually goes back to an interview with a pastor that Nathan did in 2011 when starting this work. And if you haven't listened to our previous interviews with Nathan, he talked about this in there where he said, I wanted to start this like 10, 15 years ago, but I didn't know where to start. I was really angry and no one would talk to me except for one pastor. But he starts out with a piece of that interview out of honor and respect for that pastor. And then kind of from there, though, we jump right into the content, the interviews, everything else in a very fast-paced episode 1. But I love the way they kind of frame this as we jump into it. You kind of find Nathan in this empty room on the end of like a two-way glass where someone's asking him questions. And you start to realize through episode 1, the questions that this person's asking, these are questions that critics of the religion business have been asking for years. The entire time they've worked through this documentary, they've been hearing questions like this. Questions like, why do you hate the church? How do you choose your targets? How do you go through all of that stuff? And again, I think that is a very cool way to start it. But also, in episode 1, you kick off this really important question that Nathan's asking that is going to walk through kind of the whole series. But this question is something that a lot of the different interviews are going to speak to. And it's this question: why does an organization want to be a church? Okay, so what is a church and why does an organization want to be a church? And the answer that we find in episode 1 time and time again, we don't get a great answer of what is a church. People kind of struggle through this answer. But when you start asking the question about some organizations that are classified as churches and they introduce this idea that most of us would say are not churches, well, when you start diving into that and you ask this question, why would an organization want to be a church if they're not clearly a church? And the answer is usually this: it's usually less accountability and less compliance. So we just open up Pandora's box early on in episode 1. In episode 1, it starts out pretty fast paced. You're going to see a lot of well known faces in episode 1. Even if we don't get into their stories yet, it gives you this idea that a lot of these stories are coming. Not all of them are going to have stories on them, but a lot of them will. You see faces like Kenneth Copeland, Mike Todd, Jesse Duplantis, Robert Morris, Ed Young Jr., Stovall Weems, Benny Hinn, Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, and Franklin Graham. So there's a lot of well-known evangelical faces from the very beginning. And really, once you dive into the content, one of the main conversations that's framing episode 1 is a conversation that Nathan starts with former IRS nonprofit lead and current professor of law, Philip Hackney. And again, it runs all the way through not only this episode, but this interview with Philip Hackney is going to run through the entire show because Philip was the former IRS lead for overseeing all nonprofits in the United States. And he really breaks down nonprofit tax law, how these things work lawfully, why churches are able to do some of the kind of sketchy seeming things that they do, where that came from. And it's a super cool conversation. So they introduced that in episode 1. And I think you're going to love that conversation with Philip Hackney. Okay. Now, Nathan also talks to a lot of people in episode 1. You're getting introduced to a lot of people. And like I said, remember this, pretty much everybody you get introduced to, you're going to hear from them throughout the show. So really pay attention in episode 1. They're going to continue to remind you who these people are, but pay attention because the conversation is just getting started with all of these people. None of these conversations are ending in episode 1, okay? And here are just a couple of people that Nathan talks to and kicks the conversation off with in episode 1. He talks with development economist Bruce Wittick. He talks to investigative reporter that a lot of you guys know, Julie Roys. He talks to a private investigator who works with the Trinity Foundation, Pete Evans. He talks to an accounting professor, Spencer Anderson. He talks to a church history PhD and a professor of biblical studies, Carl Truman. He talks to a political science professor who's also a bivocational pastor in Ryan Burge. He talks to a professor of philosophy and religious studies. He talks to researchers, and he talks to the director of the Center for the Study of Global Christianity, Gina Zerlo. So it is packed with expert analysis and the beginning of interviews that are going to run all the way through this. And then in every episode, you're going to pick up usually some additional interviews as well, but all of these interviews really set the tone. A lot of really cool voices that you get to hear from. But again, what's one of the main questions that we're asking in this episode that's going to run throughout the whole show? Nathan's asking the question, what is a church? And one of the things he shows in this episode really early on that runs all the way through is he shows that churches, at least in the United States today, whether they should be or not, whether that's what Jesus intended or not, and I think most of us would say Jesus probably didn't intend this. It probably wasn't on anybody in the first century's bingo card. But regardless, he shows that churches today in the United States are corporations and they are businesses. And before they can even become a church from an IRS standpoint, they have to form as a corporation. And Nathan talks with Philip Hackney about this, right? He talks about this idea that even though nonprofits are considered nonprofits, they're still businesses and they still can make a profit. So they dive into this misnomer what actually is a nonprofit, because a lot of us don't realize what a nonprofit is. As someone who leads a nonprofit, I really appreciated the way that they dove into this. But even though they're nonprofits, they dive into this idea they're still businesses. they're still corporations. And at times, they're really big businesses, but they're big businesses, big corporations with tax exempt status for being a church. And there's good and there's bad to that. Okay. But here's one thing that comes out in episode one, and they really show their work on this that's uncomfortable. Once you get classified as a church, one thing happens very clearly: the oversight and the accountability almost stops completely. Other than internal oversight, the internal oversight that the church does, there's next to no, if any, external oversight once an organization becomes a church. And they paint a pretty compelling picture about the hidden money and the lack of accountability with churches and religious nonprofits. That doesn't mean every church that has these issues is a bad church, but again, it's a pretty compelling picture. These are issues that run across the church and the nonprofit sector. It's just really easy to happen, especially, they talk about churches being the only nonprofit. Talk about this a lot in episode one. Churches are the only nonprofit that do not have to file a 990 or any type of government financial disclosure. Okay, so individuals, we got to file tax returns. Corporations have to file tax returns. Secular nonprofits like SAI, we have to file a 990 form in lieu of a tax return that says this is what we're bringing in, this is what we're spending on programs, this is who our board is, this is what our top wage earners are, anybody who makes over $100,000. Churches don't have to do any of that, and they explain some other organizations that aren't quite churches that, because they're connected to churches, don't have to do that. It's a pretty deep rabbit hole. I don't want to spoil it for you. Very interesting. You're going to want to go watch it. And I think pretty much any Christian who watches this, unless you're pretty deep into these conversations already, like we are, you're going to be surprised. And even if you know this stuff, I know for me, it made me think a little differently about it, the way that they presented. Okay. But they also talk in episode one about how corporations that don't seem to be churches, like I said, how do they end up getting classified as churches? There are some pretty wild organizations they talk about that have gotten classified as churches. So they talk about how that is and why defining a church is, really complex and muddy. When you're thinking about like legally or government-wise, defining what a church is, it's way more complex and muddy than most of us think, and it's causing a lot of concerning issues. It's actually so muddy that they take you pretty far down the rabbit hole, so far down that they talk in episode one. And again, this just does not start slow once you get into this. They're talking about how shell corporations and investment firms have actually become churches and have been used to hide money. Now, when you think about a church, you're probably not thinking about investment firms, and you're definitely not thinking about shell corporations hiding money. All those things seem antithetical, opposite of church, yet those are conversations we're having in episode one. And honestly, at times, it feels more like a Breaking Bad episode at times than it does a documentary about the church. But the experts who are being interviewed, they show their receipts, and you feel a little bit icky at times. But even though you feel icky, you're interested to know more because, again, you're probably going to learn some stuff that you did not know. And all it does is raise more questions. They're good questions to ask. Also in episode one, again, like I said, once it starts rolling, it moves pretty fast. In episode one, we see Nathan get kicked out of a Christian ministry event before he even asks the first question. Just for being there, they notice who he is and they kick him out. And it's wild, guys. It is wild to see how they treat him, especially because they know it's being recorded. And they immediately are trying to get him to stop recording. One thing you're going to see, this isn't just episode one, this is throughout. You see a ton in this docuseries. Some of these church leaders are terrified of a camera. And this is not in episode one, but one actually says that he believes a camera is more dangerous than a firearm. Literally says that. So there's a lot of fear of cameras. That is not a good look for me. Not a good look to me. But you see that in episode one. You also see Nathan not just sit down with a ministry and try to ask questions that kicks him out, not just talk about shell corporations and all this, not just sit down and talk about, churches that are corporations. He also sits down with a bivocational pastor of a small and dying church. And he sits down with members of the struggling church as well. So this isn't just a mega church bash. It's not just a mega church documentary. He's sitting down with all kinds of people starting from episode one. And actually, he discusses a little bit of the impact megachurches have on smaller churches in their community, and the impact that megachurches have on the Christian community as a whole, with everyday churchgoers, right? So he's not just talking to pastors and experts, he talks to everyday churchgoers in this episode. Um, they also kick off a conversation in episode one about the massive amount of money. And when I say massive, this is not hyperbole, I mean massive. There's so much money that goes through churches globally, and they even talk about the shocking amount that is estimated to be stolen in churches every year. That's $53 billion with a B. $53 billion is estimated to go missing, or be stolen running throughout the show. They're going to talk about that and actually what those numbers are estimated to be when the next data comes out. But episode one is super cool to me because it starts out by leaning into the tension. And like I said earlier, discussing some of those common questions that critics ask. Like they ask Nathan questions. I've seen this on social media. Why do you hate the church? How do you determine what your targets are? And he really just leans into it and says, I don't think those are the right questions. He doesn't even say, I don't hate the church. And I know that Nathan doesn't hate the church. But what he says is, I think a better question is, what is the church? Let's start with that question first. They ask, how do you determine your targets? He's like, there are no targets. I just follow the breadcrumbs that God puts in front of me. So I appreciate and think it's very cool how he leans into the tension right off the bat, the stuff that people are trying to use to discredit the documentary and trying to discredit Nathan. There's some of the questions that they're leaning into from the very beginning of this series and this episode. Okay. Episode one, super entertaining and visually appealing. Okay, so if you like film and stuff, or you're creative, you're going to enjoy this. But again, it will start off a little slow for some people. So if you feel like it's starting off slow because you want to get into the action, don't give up. Fast forward, skip forward a little bit if you need, because this episode really sets the tone well for this series. And in the next few episodes, we're going to be able to actually talk even more deeper about some of the stuff that they bring up. We're going to talk deeper about it. But episode one is really just about setting that tone. What is a church? And churches in the United States, they look very different than maybe what we thought a church was. We got to start asking different questions before we can get to the truth. And it introduces you to a ton of people that you're going to hear from. And then episode two starts right there with a brand new story, kicks right off of the bat, right? So, and I think this is the mark of a really good docuseries to me. I've watched a lot of documentaries and docuseries, and a lot of times you start out really, really high, and then you hit these kind of dips, these ebbs and flows. I think the episodes get better as they build, and episode one builds really strong and builds right into episode two. I'm going to be honest, it's not my favorite episode, but it's a really good start to a very important conversation. And guys, I think you'll like it. If you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend that you head over right now and give it a watch. And if you haven't bought the series yet, you can use the link if you're interested in the description below to get 10% off. Also, I think they give even more off, like $5 off, if you download the Transparency app that they have built to help people find some of the most transparent nonprofits. But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on episode one. I'm going to be back soon with an episode two recap and review. We're going to go a lot deeper into episode two. But I want to give you a chance to catch up if you haven't. So I'll be back soon with that episode, and I will see you there. But until then, grace and peace.